Hi, and welcome to SIFCon. We are here with the low-tech weapon and armor panel, and I'd like to introduce you to Steaphen and Fick, who will be showing us all kinds of sharp, pointy things and blunt objects and armor and weapons to our heart's content.
Hey everybody, welcome for joining us today. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am, what my experience is. I started fighting with European bladed weapons in 1989 in full armor. I've had an opportunity to fight with pretty much every European bladed weapon or some version of it that there is. I've even had the chance to be in Mexico and fight on top of an Aztec temple, which is, quite a thing to do. I have at one time in England, in Wales actually, I did a fighting retreat on the wall of a castle from barricade to barricade. So with all of this experience and with all the different weapons and styles that I fought with and against, I started doing choreography. Not on purpose, I kind of fell into it. And with that, I started choreographing for movies, for TV, for plays. I've even then started choreographing for authors. And one of the things I want to do today is I want to talk about, they say low-tech weapons is the title of this. And yes, they are, but at the same time, no, they're not low-tech. They are highly advanced for what they are.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do is talk about some of the different kinds of weapons and how they would have been used. And then we can also look at how could we recreate this in a post-apocalyptic kind of world? What kind of materials could we use? At the apocalypse, we are not going to have the technology to make these kinds of things. We won't. But how can we take what we already have and readjust it so it'll be useful to us? First thing I want to do is talk about a little bit of armor. And we're going to use this suit as an example. I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about the different parts of the armor. There are several different styles of helmets and that kind of thing. And if you have a question, please just type it in and we'll go through and I'll answer all the questions that I can. I'll give you the best information I can give you. If I don't know, I'll lie to you and make it sound good. But don't hesitate to ask questions. So when we look at a suit of armor, we have, as everybody knows, the helmet. Then we have the breastplate and the backplate. And together, the breastplate and backplate are known as the cuirass. From the cuirass, we have, going up to the arms, we have the shoulders. And there's two different names for the shoulders. This one has what's called pauldrons. And pauldrons are shoulder covers that also overlap the cuirass. So it gives you greater protection over the shoulder and the armpit, and it protects against that. I'm going to rotate us just a moment to that suit. When we look at this suit, it has a much smaller, let me pull one off. No, here we go. I'll just bring this whole thing. So here we have a breastplate over mail. My lovely assistant. So we have a breastplate over mail. This is called a spalder. And a spalder is just a small piece that covers the ball joint of the armor. I'm sorry, of the shoulder. But you'll notice it leaves the whole armpit exposed.
Exposed, yeah.
And to cover this armpit, what they did is they made on this other suit back here,
You're just hauling all your suits around.
so what they did on this one, again, this one has a spalder versus a pauldron, which covers more of the shoulder like this one. And to cover the armpit, they put these little things on here, little satellite dishes. And those are, they're called a rondelle, which is French and just means round, or a bezigue. And that's how they'd protect the armpits. And then they'd add things to the breastplate to extend the length down. And if these are lames, the individual pieces, and you'll notice these are mobile, and it actually allows you to bend over and touch your toes.
Wow.
Because a breastplate stops at the ribs, at the natural waist. So you can actually, with it stopping here, bend all the way down. So armor gives you all this mobility. Then you've got, here we have on the lower part of the arm, what's called the vambrace. And the vambrace, and up at the upper part of the arm, let me see if I can unbuckle this. The upper part of the arm, which is above the elbow, is the rear brace. And the reason those parts are important is that gives you the full arm protection, and then your spalder or your pauldron covers the upper part of the arm. All of this is strapped in multiple places. So on this breastplate, or this cuirass, you've got the 2 points of contact on the shoulder. It sits really tight at the ribs, really tight. And if you look at the body, it's got all these straps, all these buckle points. So that allows you to cinch it to the body. And why that's important for us when you're having to fight in it is that means the tighter it is to the body, the more it moves with you. It's like a nice suit. It just flows with your whole body. And then once we get down to the legs, we have the leg here, this upper part is called a cuisse. And the cuisse covers the thigh. Then at the bottom, which I don't think we can see here. Yeah, there we go. The bottom of the leg is called the greave. And if we move it back a little bit, so here we have the greave, and then to cover the foot, we have a sabaton. Most of the words that we use on the armor these days are French. There's a lot of technology in this, just to create the metal. But we've all seen versions of this in Mad Max, in other things. This can be made out of tires.
Oh, wow.
Actually in the SCA, they would, up until recently, in fact, I think they still are in some places, they make a full suit of armor out of pickle barrels. So think of those blue water bottles or water, 55-gallon drums.
Yeah.
There's instant armor supplies right there. Because it doesn't need to stop a bullet. What it needs to do is stop a cut or a thrust, or redirect a cut or a thrust.
So, Steaphen, can I ask how long that it would take to put one of those suits of armor on?
Sure. You cannot put it on yourself. There's a reason that they had squires.
Yeah.
You need somebody to help you put this on. But if I have somebody who knows what they're doing to help me, I can be in this full suit in 10 minutes.
That's pretty impressive. I mean, with the amount of buckles that you're talking about, that's a lot of work.
It is.
And you have to trust whoever's putting it on if you're actually going into combat, because...
Right. And even if it's not put on right, I went into one fight one time and I didn't even realize it until I'd already been in the fight for a little bit. My arms felt funny. And that's because they put my arms on backwards. So even if they're not put on perfectly, you can still work in it. I was talking about connection points. The shoulder has one connection point at the top and another connection point over the bicep. So while the bicep is not tight, you cannot have the strap around the bicep tight or it will reduce movement. Because every time you lift up your sword, your bicep flexes. And if it's tight, that's going to lock your arm in, which is something that people don't think about. So you've got 2 points of contact on the shoulder. You'll notice this one is tied on. That's a common way to do it. It's called pointing. And you point your armor to your arming clothes, gambeson or something like that.
Yeah.
This is the medieval equivalent of duct tape. So if I wanted to make this suit of armor now, I would get phone books and magazines.
Wow.
Phone books around the body, magazine on the upper, a couple magazines on the upper arm and the lower arm. I can strap a couple over my shoulders, and I now have a full upper body suit of armor. And again, it's not going to stop a gun, a bullet, or necessarily even a spear. But what it will do is redirect thrusting and cutting strikes. Yeah. And mostly that's all I need to do. Because if you're in a fight and you're standing still, you've already done something terribly, terribly wrong. I tell my guys here at my school that there's only one thing you can do wrong in a fight, and that's nothing. To do nothing is the only thing you can do wrong. Doing anything is better than nothing. So having these shapes to glance attacks off means you're moving, so you're doing something. On the arm, we've got pointed to the gambeson, and then another strap at the elbow and 2 straps at the vambrace. So on just this one arm, we have 4 points of contact. Sometimes there's 5 because there's a hole drilled in the elbow, and that allows us to tie the elbow on, or tie the elbow to the gambeson, meaning that it pulls my elbow in tight, and so that when I'm moving, there's no flopping of equipment around.
Yeah, you wouldn't want holes where something could get up in there.
Not just that. What it'll do is if it's flopping around, that means every time I move, it goes out and in. And now my own armor is beating me.
Yeah.
And so I want to keep it tight so that it doesn't do that. It's like playing football with a helmet that's too big. You're not only taking the force of the incoming player, you're taking the strike from your own helmet.
Yeah.
So it's things that we need to avoid. And so if you are writing about somebody having to wear armor, you want it to be tight. So it is a suit of, it's a suit of clothing just made out of metal instead of material.
Yeah.
And for like this suit, One of the things on this suit is this little V thing right here.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually, it's called a stop. This is designed so that if I get stabbed, the blade hits my armor and slides up, hits this, and it guides it away from my throat. So even just thinking about how to put in something not to stop the enemy's attack, but to redirect it, there's a lot going in there. So suits of armor were amazing, and we can make them out of water barrels, tires, magazines, phone books, or just cloth, wrapped up in cloth to reduce the amount of force from a cut or a thrust. In the Crusades, the Saracen armies wore cloth armor, whereas the European armies wore mail. And one of the things about cloth is if you get stabbed and it does penetrate you, it's going to push that material, whatever you're wearing, into your body. And then as it goes out, sometimes that material stays in there.
Oh.
Well, if you're wearing armor that has grease on it to keep it from rusting, all that metal and grease is in the penetrating wound. Whereas with cloth, it's a cleaner strike. So neat things that they can make armor out of. And of course, which was also historically done, you can make it out of leather.
Yeah, I've read a lot about leather armor and mail, and just in my own research, even plate. So it's really fascinating to see not just like a diagram or pictures, but like the actual suit of armor.
Yeah, when you start looking at leather armor, if it's hardened, it's called kerboily. And kerboily could be boiled or waxed. So if you put leather in hot water and then shape it, it takes on that shape and hardens. While it's not as good as steel or iron, it's really pretty close.
Yeah.
And the Roman auxiliaries would wear leather helmets as well.
Well, I imagine it's a leather armor suit would be a lot cheaper, so more accessible to, someone who is not a wealthy upper class person.
Right. And you can shape it too to give it different looks, such as the muscle cuirass of the Renaissance or the Romanesque era. So let me get this guy out of the way and let's talk some swords.
You are speaking my language, sir. You know me, I love a good sword.
So let's actually start chronologically. I'm going to rotate you around a little bit. To this sword rack. As one does, right?
I'm pretty jealous right now.
So this style of sword right here, this is a sword that would have been used during the early 1400s, during the time of Agincourt. And so when you're looking at something like this, we have a short handle with a wide blade and a sharp thrusting point. Versus, let me grab another sword real quick. Versus the sword that was used in the Viking or Crusader era. So if we look at a sword that would have been used in the Viking era, we've got a sword that has a simple grip,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't pointed.
What?
They were not pointed. They were more rounded than pointed.
That's
Because
crazy.
this was definitely more of a cutting sword than a thrusting sword. And I want to make sure that when we are cutting, I'm having to deal with wool and linen and maybe some leather, but not a lot. And so this means that I'm using it to cut. I can still thrust with it, but it's not an ideal thrusting weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is your classic Viking sword. One of the things that's interesting about it is when people grab onto a sword, the first thing they want to do is hold it like a hammer. And I teach people, and I believe that it's not used in this way, like a hammer. Instead, it's turned to 45 degrees so
That
that
makes
I can
sense.
hold it here. That means that this little guard is over my knuckle, and now I'm protected. And let me grab one more thing. When I've got my shield and my sword, I'm able with this grip to rotate right around my position so I can move it in and cut without getting in the way of my own shield.
That makes a lot of sense.
And this is a traditionally made shield. It's an experiment that we did. It's poplar wood planks that are thinner at the rim than at the center and has hide glue. For a long time, I thought that these shields, they're commonly called Viking shields, but a better name for it is a center grip round. And you can kind of see why it'd be called a center grip round shield. You'll notice that the grip is not centered. It's actually
No, I
to
mean,
one
that
side.
makes sense because you want the bigger part, bigger part of your
Right.
hand to be able to have better, and then you anchor with your thumb. That makes a lot of sense.
But with every recreation we see today, it's all dead in the center. And there's no reason for it to be centered.
No.
So this gives me greater flexibility. And if for some reason I need to shift, all I need to do is turn it over. So it gives me the greatest amount of mobility in my shield hand without locking my hand onto the wood. So this is actually goat hide on the front of it with horsehide glue.
Oh, interesting.
So, and it's different colors because, like I said, it's an experiment we were running. At this seam, this side is a single layer of goat hide. This side is a double layer of goat hide. This side has one layer of hide glue, and this side has 2 layers of hide glue. And the reason we did that is we wanted to see, does an extra layer really do anything? Which it didn't appear to. But these little patches here are from stab wounds and arrows. And we found that if you carry little pieces of hide in your pouch, you throw it in a pan, you melt it down, it becomes glue, you put another patch over it and then just use that hide glue, you've now patched your shield and it's reusable in about 2.5 hours.
That's not bad. I mean, carrying your own, it's like having a tire patch kit or something like that.
Exactly. And so they were doing all this. So when we talk low tech, this is not hard to make.
No.
And yet the technology is so advanced. Because I never would have thought about having a tire repair kit with me all the time, but they did.
Yeah, that's crazy.
The centerpiece here is called the boss. And the boss is what protects the knuckles that come outside of the shield. This is actually a Saxon version because it's got like a little mushroom here.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be used for capturing somebody's blade or for hooking a shield in the shield line and then opening up for an attack. So this was not only defensive, it was also an offensive tool. And if you look at the shape of it, it's not a complicated shape to make.
No.
So you can pound this out or use a little like aluminum bowl
Mm-hmm.
and then weld on or piece of metal and just pound it out. Weld this on and then weld on a little mushroom cap and you've now got a Saxon boss.
But you have to think that they didn't have a welder or something like that, so that they came up with that kind of design. It's just like you said, it's called low-tech armor, but a lot of science, at least for the time, went into that.
Yes, oh, very much so. And as the technology changed, this is what's known as a knightly sword, your classic knightly sword, also sometimes called a Norman sword. And this one would come to a point. This is the style of sword that would have been used during the Crusades. So here's another version of that same sword. This is like what you would see carried. It doesn't come to a sharp point because
Blunt.
they're mostly fighting against mail armor. And so you're not going to be able to stab one-handed through mail. So why spend all that time on a point, especially if it's going to come to an acute point and then break off in the middle of the fight?
Yeah.
What if one of your characters is making swords? An important thing to remember is that the sharper your sword or the sharper your point, the smaller the surface area. Therefore, the easier it breaks. We sharpen a knife or a sword by thinning out the metal.
Yeah.
So the swords in Europe, or any sword that was going to be striking another sword or another chunk of metal, would not have a razor edge on it.
We have a question from Sam
Yeah.
Hurst. He wants to know, why did the sword replace the spear? It seems like the reach would have been a huge advantage.
It truly is. So here is your classic spear. When I do demonstrations for schools and things, this is the everyday man's, the Fuhrer's weapon. This is a weapon of life, a tool of life, because I can use the spear to knock fruit out of trees. I can use it for hunting. If I get stuck in the woods, I stick it in the ground, tie my cloak to it, now I have a tent. If I get injured, I've got a walking stick. This is something that everybody carried. But because everybody carried it, there's nothing special. The sword took over prominence not as a useful weapon, but as a status weapon.
That makes sense.
No, that's not to say it wasn't useful, because it's a big knife. How could it not be useful? But it's more useful if you're fighting someone on foot, unarmored.
Yeah.
If they're armored, my sword doesn't do me a lot of good. This is a much better weapon. But from strictly a status point, the sword took prominence, which is why it's still worn by military officers.
Mr. Herbst would know something about that.
It's all about the status. And it's carried by gentlemen. And officers have always been associated with gentlemen.
We have another question from Mr. James Fox. If we're wanting to adapt hand-to-hand close quarters combat in sci-fi setting, how much of a nod should we give to those ancient weapons?
Is that so? Whether it's in space or in atmosphere, a cutting weapon or a thrusting weapon's very good, very useful. There's a great line in Starship Troopers, the movie. You know, sir, if we can nuke them, why should I learn how to throw a knife? Put your hand against the wall, son. Right? You remember that line? The more technological we get, the more we leave out these. But if I'm unable to push a button, none of that technology matters. If for some reason a giant EMP cuts out electrical use in the world, it doesn't matter how technologically advanced we are. Yeah. It's going to come right back to these.
That makes a lot of sense.
This is the base that everything is built on. Another reason, going back to the previous question, that the sword took over for the spear, it's a status symbol because it costs more. There's more metal in the sword than in the spear. It's more expensive. Therefore, in order to afford it, I must be more important. Not that anything like that goes on today in mindsets. So we've passed the Norman or the knightly sword. That was used from the 1100s to the 1350s, 1400s. Then we get into, in the 1400s, this style of sword again. And this is the style of sword that would have been used at Agincourt. Now, one of my favorite series of books is Bio of a Space Tyrant. And one of the things I really liked about that is they're in space and they're wearing spacesuits. They have to carry their own atmosphere with them. So one of the weapons that they carry is a small sword. Because I only need to put a small hole in a suit, and then he's so focused on patching that hole that he's not thinking about me anymore.
Very true.
That's basically what this sword does. It was very short. It was used with a shield. And then this was meant for putting holes in their suits. Now, they weren't atmosphered, but I stick a hole in somebody's armpit, and it doesn't matter whether they're carrying their atmosphere or not. They're busy thinking about that.
Yeah, they're busy trying to patch up.
Yeah. And that, when you go back to James's question, that's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give them something to think about other than me. There's a difference when we look at combat between individual combat and massed combat. In individual combat, I have to deal with you until one of us is unable or unwilling to continue the fight. In mass combat, I only need to deal with you until I can get past you. Then somebody else will deal with what's left. And then somebody will pass on beyond that. So there's not fencing, if you will, in a mass combat because it doesn't work. If I get so focused on you, Christina, that you and I are fighting the whole time, I'm not going to see your buddy that comes from right there and sticks me in the side of the head or in the armpit.
Yeah,
so
that's
it's not
true.
about focusing on one person. It's about that level of mobility.
It's about attaining your goal and moving forward.
Say that again?
It's about attaining your goal and moving forward.
Right. One of the things I teach is Let me grab it. I think you'll recognize these.
We had a comment, but it's just a small hole. I
Unfortunately,
like
there's
the
all these
fact.
fluids that I like to keep in my body. So this selection, right, when I'm teaching naval stuff, cutlass, tomahawk, knife and cutlass, we're working on board ship, which sailing ships were not that big. So 100 feet from stern to bow, not super big.
That's pretty insane.
But because I'm on this little ship, I can't go backwards. That is the only land around me for hundreds and hundreds of miles. There is no going backward. Combat is about moving forward. And so all of these things are meant to allow you the ability to move forward. And in the fight, going back to that statement, it's only a little hole. That little hole that I just put into whoever I'm facing, while they're thinking about, hey, that sucks. I'm moving past them, and my buddy's coming up behind me. And while they're going, hey, you just stabbed me, then he's getting hit again. That's combat.
Yeah.
I don't need to put you down. I need to make you unwilling to continue with me. And that's what all these wonderful little tools do. And these move fast and they're scary.
Yeah.
I've worked on a couple projects where we've fought with these. And while they're a lot of fun in fencing, the idea of actually fighting on board a ship with this kind of stuff just boggles my mind that they did it.
It's terrifying. I mean, because you've got the vessel that's moving and so many sharp things flying around. Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Now, let's take that into space. The last panel I just watched was about space opera.
Yeah.
Imagine, dealing with this. You're on board ship. They blew the atmosphere because they knew there was going to be hand-to-hand, and everybody's in suits. Maybe they still have gravity on. Even if they don't, having the little beaks like this doesn't take a lot to rip the material.
Yeah, I was thinking, you catch the material at the right angle, you can, not just a small hole, you're gonna slash that suit.
Yeah. And then the escaping gases push you and him apart, and maybe you can even use that to angle yourself at the next opponent.
That's pretty good. Are you taking notes, James? It's a pretty good idea.
Right? Because Newtonian law, an object in motion stays in motion until acted upon by another object. That other object will be my muscles or someone else or something else. So I kind of jumped ahead to the 18th century, but let me put these down.
In a few minutes, we're gonna take. In a couple minutes, we're gonna start taking last questions.
Oh wow!
Can't believe
been that long already?
Yeah, we've been here for about 40 minutes now.
Wow! So let me take you to this one. This is the classic sword that everybody knows, but with a slight twitch. This one is called a purge. And these are, well, sexy and also scary because it has this like serration. So it's like I was at doing a school demonstration yesterday for a middle school. And one of the kids said, it's like a giant bread knife.
That's what it looks like.
So this kind of sword when we look at books or movies or video games, they use it just for hacking and slashing. I'm going to spin us around for a moment.
Caitlin Rose loves that sword.
What's that?
Caitlin Rose loves that sword.
So this one, we see them cutting and stabbing with it, but a long sword like this is actually 3 different weapons. The sword is for fighting against the unarmored person. If they're in armor, my sword does me no good. This goes back to that question about the spear. I reach up and I grab my sword by the blade like this, and now I've turned my sword into a short spear or a dagger, and that allows me to get up to my opponents and stab them in the armpit or in the eye or in the groin. So now I'm better able to control where my point goes so I can wrestle with it and have a dagger. And if they get too far away, I use the other end, and now I've got a hammer.
Wow.
So this is actually 3 different weapons. I have my sword, I have my dagger, and I have my hammer. And
That's
all
a
of
pretty
these
nice
are in
hammer.
that one sword. And that'll bring me to my last one. I want to talk about low tech. This is the poleaxe. And we've heard the term drop like they were poleaxed. Drop like they were hit with that. You can see why they would drop. The poleaxe, I like to think of it as a medieval can opener. It's meant for taking a man out of armor 1 piece at a time. I have my axe for chopping in, my hammer for crushing, my spear point for thrusting, and a spear point on the other end.
Wow.
And it even has hooks on the sides so that if somebody's riding by and I hook and I chop in, I can use that to hook on something and pull them off balance and then stab them. So this is the poleaxe. In 1599, there was a guy called George Silver in England who wrote a book called Paradox of Defense. In England, in the 16th century, this was known as a battle axe. So in English literature, this is a battle axe, not that big 2-headed axe. That's more of a fantasy style weapon. This is your traditional battle axe. And I will tell you, this is much, much scarier than that big double-headed axe.
Yeah.
There's 2 versions of it. There's this kind that has a hammerhead and an axe, or we have this style. Again, I've got a spear point on the back end, but now I have an axe and a hook and a dagger blade. And this is called a bec de Corbin or raven's beak. And to let you know what they thought about how they use this weapon, see that little hole right here by the blade?
Mm-hmm.
That's meant to put your finger in for punching.
Oh, wow.
That's how close you would be with this thing. So that's actually a finger grip.
I have one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yes.
James was asking about improvised weapons for post-apocalyptic settings.
Spearheads and arrowheads out of glass, because you can map glass, or you can use other versions of rock. For armor, or arrowheads, or even spearheads, street signs. They make great armor and weapons.
That's pretty cool.
For a poleaxe, you get a stick a rock, and a large nail, and some duct tape, and now you've got a poleaxe. So then for bladed weapons, like larger swords or things like that, you can grind down leaf springs, although that's a lot of metal, or you can take car hoods and layer them together. And the car hood, all these old dying cars, you have a source of metal for your armor. And if you put the metal together, you like rivet it together, you can make larger swords.
That's pretty cool. Well, Steaphen, I could sit here and spend about 3 hours talking armor and weapons and not get tired at all, but I think we're going to have to start wrapping it up here. If you want to tell everyone a little bit about your school and where they can find more information about you.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, my website is swordfightingschool.com. Our YouTube channel is Sword Fighting School, all one word. Instagram is Sword Fighting School. I think you've seen a
theme.
Our Facebook page is actually Davenrich European Martial Arts. And so we have, Twitter is Sword Fighting School. We do most of our work, our posting on Instagram and Facebook, although I post stuff to Twitter from Instagram. But I've also written a couple of books. One book is called The Beginner's Guide to the Longsword. It was published by Black Belt Books, who did all the magazines and all those. It was the first European-themed book they had ever printed, and the first weapons-oriented book they'd done in over a decade. And I've got a book right now that's at the editor called The Secret Language of Conflict. This is a book about body language within the fight, before and during the fight. And then I just finished a book to send to the editor called The Author's Guide to Arms and Armor. Because writing a book, I do all this research. So I wanted to create a reference guide that you could just go to and find European weapons with some other touching on some things in Japan and the Middle East, but mostly European, from the Bronze Age to the 19th century.
I'm very much looking forward to that book.
So thank you very much for having me. Had a great time. I hope you all enjoyed it as well.
I enjoyed it immensely, sir. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you for thank you for doing this. Oh, I was just saying thank you for doing this. It was awesome to get to peek into your armory.
And tomorrow I get to do a panel with James on the feelings and what it's like to be in a fight, so you can write that into your books. And
I'll be there for that.
Just through a punch. We're going to go much more than that. Really looking forward to spending time working with James on this.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your help, Christina.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye. I can't believe it went